A courtroom always remembers. Not the verdicts, but the looks, the silence, the weight of who's allowed to speak. Power doesn't always wear a badge, and truth doesn't always raise its voice. That day she walked in alone. No press, no fanfare, just presence. They saw her as a joke, another face they could dismiss without consequence. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't explain. She waited, let the lies pile up, let the system expose itself. And then with one sentence, she turned the room to ice. "I am the Deputy Director of Homeland Security." The laughter died, the color drained, and suddenly everyone remembered what justice is supposed to feel like. Sharp, unforgiving, true. So tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of the Westvale County Courthouse, casting long, trembling beams across the polished marble floors, where dust motes drifted like quiet ghosts. The room smelled faintly of pine oil and old books, and the air carried the low murmur of expectation, the kind that settles before a storm when everyone knows something is coming, but no one knows from which direction. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, some brisk with confidence, others hesitant, dragged out like people trying to delay the inevitable. Reporters clustered near the entrance with notepads and cameras in hand, some whispering into microphones, others scribbling furiously, all watching for one person in particular, the black woman they'd never seen before, but whose name had already made its way onto every docket in town. Delilah Raines walked into that courtroom with a calm that wasn't casual. It was practiced, honed, the kind of calm you wear like armor when you know eyes are scanning your every move, not with curiosity, but with judgment. She wore a charcoal gray pantsuit that fit her lean frame with clean, precise lines, her coiled hair pulled back into a low, no-nonsense bun. No jewelry, no flash, just a leather folio tucked under one arm and a look in her eyes that said she had weighed this moment down to its last breath. Her heels made a deliberate click on the floor, with each step a sound that broke through the murmurs like the metronome of inevitability. She took her seat at the defendant's table without glancing at the two officers already there, Detective Craig Weller and Deputy Scott Boone, who smirked and leaned back in their chairs like two boys who had won the coin toss and were just waiting to collect their prize. Craig was thick-set, silver-haired, the kind of man who spoke in short sentences and laughed too loudly at his own jokes. Scott, younger and sharper-featured, bounced his leg under the table and occasionally flicked glances toward the gallery like he expected applause. Both of them had the casual arrogance of men who believed the system would never turn on them because it had always tilted in their favor. "She looks nervous," Scott muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably rehearsed something from a YouTube video. These people think that's enough." Craig chuckled under his breath, arms folded, eyes fixed on Delilah like she was a riddle that didn't need solving. "Won't matter," he said. "By the end of today she'll be begging for a deal." Delilah heard them, of course. She didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the cuffs of her jacket with a quiet elegance, then folded her hands on the table like someone preparing for communion. What they didn't know and couldn't imagine was that Delilah Raines had spent 3 decades moving through corridors where power hung in the air like voltage, where every word spoken was measured and every silence loaded. She had spoken to senators behind closed doors and debriefed military generals with coffee still steaming in their cups. But this was something different. This wasn't a conference table, this was a theater, and they were about to perform their version of justice. Across the aisle, her attorney Sterling Clay adjusted his tie and leaned toward her with a low voice, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "They're underestimating you," he said. "Let them." She nodded, once eyes steady. "That's the plan." The judge entered with a rustle of robes and a sharp rap of the gavel, and the courtroom rose like one breathing thing. Judge Beverly Kane, pale-poised, nearing 70, scanned the room with eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze paused briefly on Delilah before settling on the docket. There was no friendliness there, but there wasn't dismissal either. Only calculation, only readiness. "Be seated," she said. "Let's begin." And just like that, the play began. The prosecutor, Marcia Leake, stood and launched into an opening statement that painted Delilah as disruptive, entitled Dangerously Misinformed. She used phrases like willfully obstructed, undermined active investigation, and escalated the situation. Her tone was crisp, professional, but threaded with a subtle patronization that wrapped every sentence in an invisible sneer. Delilah didn't move. She listened. Not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, to the certainty, to the disdain. The jury, 12 people in varying shades of morning fatigue and cautious detachment, seemed to lean forward just enough to hear her being framed like a caricature. Sterling watched the jurors too, his expression unreadable. When the prosecution rested its statement, he rose slowly, as though giving gravity time to catch up with him. "We will present," he said, "voice, even not a theory, but a sequence of facts. You will hear testimony, and you will see footage. You will understand that what happened wasn't obstruction, it was vigilance. And the reason she's sitting here today under arrest is not because she broke the law, but because she asked a question they didn't want to answer." In that moment, Delilah caught the eyes of Craig Weller, who smirked as if none of this mattered. She turned away not because she was afraid, but because the moment wasn't his. It was hers. Outside the courthouse, the city carried on. Horns blared in distant traffic. Children spilled out of buses, half awake and chewing gum. Office workers hurried toward their routines, and somewhere a radio played Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On?" The world wasn't watching yet, but it would. Inside, the air grew thick with the unsaid. The tension didn't shout it, hummed, coiled, settled into the bones. Delilah adjusted her breathing the way she had been taught during her training years ago: in through the nose, hold out through the mouth, control the rhythm, own the tempo. Do not let the moment steal your presence. This courtroom was her crucible now, not for a title, not for ego, for something larger, something rooted in every silence she had once swallowed, every injustice she had once documented and buried. This wasn't just about her. It was about what happens when the wrong people forget who they're mocking. And as the judge signaled a recess, and the courtroom began to stir, Delilah leaned toward Sterling and said softly, "Let them laugh." He smiled faintly. "They won't be laughing long." The sound of shuffling papers filled the courtroom like the soft ticking of a clock you couldn't ignore, subtle but steady. The kind of sound that made time feel heavier, somehow like even the air had started counting down. Marcia Leek adjusted her blazer and stepped forward with that lawyer's grace that says, "I've done this 100 times," before her heels, tapping a confident rhythm across the hardwood floor, her voice sharp and polished as she began to address the jury with just the right blend of legal authority and friendly persuasion. She called Delilah's actions reckless, her judgment questionable, and her tone suggested this wasn't personal, it was just procedure, just another file in a long line of morning cases that needed to be handled and moved along. Delilah sat still back, straight hands folded, face unreadable, but inside her chest a slow burn had already begun. Not rage exactly, but a deep pressure like a dam, holding back years' worth of silenced moments. She had heard this tone before in different rooms with different names, but always the same implication that someone like her must have stepped out of place, must have been too bold, too confident, too visible for comfort. Sterling didn't even look at Marcia as she spoke. He kept his eyes on the jury, reading their faces like a seasoned gambler, scanning a hand of cards, noticing the small things, how one juror kept adjusting her sleeve every time Delilah's name was mentioned, how another man's lips tightened when the word obstruction was used, how a young teacher-looking type near the end of the row leaned forward, ever so slightly, like maybe he wasn't completely sold on what was being presented. Craig Weller leaned in and whispered something to Scott Boone, who laughed a little too loud before catching himself, as if forgetting for a moment that the room was still watching. Their body language spoke volumes, relaxed, cocky, confident in a way that said they believed the script was already written, that Delilah's role was fixed and final. Scott crossed one leg over the other and drummed his fingers lightly on the table, then leaned back with a smug glance in Delilah's direction, as if to say, "We've already won." Craig stretched out his arms like he was getting comfortable for a show he already knew the ending to. Delilah didn't return their stare, but she felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders like cold metal. She shifted slightly in her seat, not out of discomfort, but to recenter herself, feet planted evenly on the floor, spine-aligned, breath slow and intentional. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, and outside the courtroom window, a pale winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the far wall, like ghostly fingers creeping toward the present. She wondered briefly what her father would have said if he'd been sitting behind her, his weathered hands folded over his cane, his quiet strength always enough to remind her who she was, even in rooms that tried to erase it. "You okay?" Sterling asked softly, not looking at her, but sensing the shift in her posture the way people do when they've walked through fire together. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice low, steady. "Let them talk." He nodded once, then turned his attention back to the judge, whose expression hadn't changed since the proceedings began, calm, measured, but not disengaged. Judge Kane watched with a particular stillness, the kind that made people nervous, because you couldn't tell whether she was agreeing with you or preparing to tear your argument apart piece by piece. As the prosecutor spoke about the dedicated officers and their tireless work in the field, Delilah saw Scott Boone glance toward the gallery, again his mouth twitching in what might have been amusement or just the leftover smirk of someone used to being believed without question. Craig sat like a statue carved out of stone, his eyes hooded but alert, occasionally scanning the faces in the courtroom, as if daring anyone to challenge what he thought he already controlled. When Marcia finished her statement, she took her seat with a satisfied glance toward the officers, who nodded slightly in return. It was a small gesture, but it told Delilah everything. This was a game to them, a pageant, a stage where they played the heroes, and she was cast as the foil. But what they hadn't considered, what they had never imagined, was that this wasn't her first time being underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last time she used that underestimation as her sharpest tool. The judge called for a brief recess, and the room began to shift like a tide, turning chairs scraping softly, whispered conversations rising like fog bodies, stretching eyes darting. Craig stood and rolled his shoulders before muttering to Scott, "She's holding herself real tight. Might crack by tomorrow." Scott chuckled. "Yeah, let her keep playing courtroom queen. Doesn't change what we've got." Delilah stood slowly, smoothed the front of her jacket, and followed Sterling into a side room, her steps measured and even each one echoing faintly off the marble like she was marking time. Behind her the courtroom filled with noise again, but in her mind she held on to the silence, that steady, powerful silence she had carried for years, the one that said, "Not yet, but soon." And when Sterling turned to speak, to offer reassurance or strategy, she simply raised one hand to stop him. "Let them think they're winning," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "We haven't even begun." The courtroom dimmed as the bailiff wheeled in a portable screen, the weight of anticipation settling into every breath, every shifting chair, every nervous cough that cut through the silence like a blade. Judge Kane gave a small nod to the technician who clicked a remote control, and the first frame of the surveillance footage flickered to life, a grainy, black-and-white image of a quiet suburban street at dusk, the kind of neighborhood where porch lights glow before sunset and wind chimes murmur against wooden railings. Delilah sat still, eyes forward, jaw tight, but not clenched, her expression neutral enough to read as composed, but guarded just enough to betray the flicker of something deeper, not fear, not anger exactly, but a kind of knowing. On screen the timestamp blinked in the lower corner, 4:37 p.m. 2 weeks prior. A line of patrol cars framed the curb in front of a modest one-story home with a sagging porch swing and a flag rustling in the breeze. Officers moved in and out of the frame, like shadows caught between purpose and performance, some writing on pads, others speaking into radios, their mouths moving but their voices unheard. The camera panned slightly as two figures came into view, Craig Weller and Scott Boone stepping out of their cruiser with the casual swagger of men who believed the world owed them its silence. Delilah appeared seconds later, walking along the sidewalk from the opposite direction, dressed in jeans, a sweatshirt, and sneakers, hair pulled back under a baseball cap. She wasn't hurried or tense, just purposeful, as if she had paused by chance on her way home. She gestured once toward the officers, and even without sound her body language was unmistakably polite, one hand out, palm slightly up, the universal sign of inquiry rather than challenge. But the moment shifted quickly. Boone stepped forward, shaking his head, his arms moving in a broad, exaggerated way that seemed more performative than communicative, while Craig hovered behind him like a wall waiting to fall. Delilah's posture never changed, but her feet stopped moving. She stood still, composed, asking for clarification in a space that clearly wasn't built to welcome it. Then, in a flash that made half the courtroom flinch, Boone reached into his belt and pulled out his cuffs with a snap, lunging toward her without warning. Craig moved in too, boxing her in as if she were a threat rather than a neighbor asking a question. The footage froze on that moment, Delilah's arms up her mouth, open mid-sentence, one officer grabbing her wrist while the other stood inches from her face. The technician paused the playback as Sterling Clay rose slowly, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a laser pointer he hadn't yet used. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking in a classroom, "I ask you, do you see a woman threatening law enforcement? Or do you see a citizen being punished for speaking?" No one answered, but the weight of the image was answer enough. The screen went black, and for a moment so did the room. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. Even the judge held her pen in midair. The spell broke when Sterling turned to the jury, then glanced back at Delilah, who hadn't taken her eyes off the now dark screen. Her chest rose and fell slowly, but her hands didn't move. There was power in restraint, and she had spent her entire career learning how to wield it. The first witness called was Gloria Webb, a retired teacher in her late 60s who had lived 2 doors down from where the incident occurred. She walked with a cane and spoke with the rhythm of someone who had raised children and taught hundreds more. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke Delilah's name, but she straightened when Sterling asked her to describe what she saw. She didn't raise her voice, Gloria said, eyes scanning the jury like she wanted to speak to each of them personally. She just asked if the officers had a warrant. That's all. And the tall one, the younger one, he grabbed her before she could finish the sentence. Sterling nodded. Did she threaten them? Gloria blinked. No, sir. She wasn't angry. She looked confused, I'd say, concerned. On cross-examination, the prosecutor tried to discredit Gloria's eyesight, asking about her prescription and when she last had an eye exam, but Gloria answered every question with quiet patience, reminding the room that sometimes you don't need perfect vision to see injustice unfold in front of you. Her testimony lingered. Even after she stepped down her slow walk across the floor, met with silence instead of whispers. Delilah watched it all without reacting, though her palms had started to sweat beneath the table. She wasn't nervous about the jury. She was worried about what came next, about how long she'd be allowed to control the pace before the pressure to reveal who she truly was would outweigh the benefit of strategic silence. She leaned towards Sterling as the next recess was announced and whispered, "Not yet. Let them keep guessing." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "It's your call," he said. "But they're circling. They know you're not just another defendant." She smiled faintly. "Good. Let them wonder." Outside, reporters hovered like bees near the marble steps, their cameras pointed at the doors, their microphones extending like antennae toward the unknown. Delilah passed them without a word, her expression unreadable, her steps as precise as they were when she entered. Inside in the space they'd just left, her image still lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen that video. Not just a woman in cuffs, but a mirror reflecting something the system didn't want to see. And the question left hanging wasn't whether she had done anything wrong. It was how long the truth could be denied before it demanded to be heard. The courtroom settled again after recess, its energy no longer buzzing with anticipation but thickening into something denser, like waiting for a storm to break over a town that had lived too long in denial. The gallery filled with people who had returned to their seats a little quieter, a little more alert, as if the surveillance footage from earlier had cracked open something they didn't yet understand but couldn't ignore. Judge Kane adjusted her glasses and gave a single nod, and Sterling Clay rose with the ease of someone who wasn't just prepared, but deeply committed to the path he was walking. "Our next witness," he announced, "is Mrs. Gloria James." The name didn't echo, but it landed with the quiet weight of someone who mattered. Gloria entered with slow steps, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane, her spine straight and her expression steady, the kind of woman who had spent decades telling teenagers to sit up straight and look her in the eyes, and had never raised her voice more than once to make it happen. She wore a soft tan sweater and a plaid skirt. Her gray hair neatly pinned her lips, pressed together in that determined line that says, "I didn't come here to perform. I came to tell the truth." She was sworn in, then seated gently by the bailiff, her hands resting on her lap like they always had during parent-teacher conferences or town hall meetings, steady and grounded in a life that had seen too much to be shaken by this. Sterling approached her slowly, as if understanding that the witness stand wasn't just a physical seat, but an emotional one. "Mrs. James," he began softly, "can you tell us where you were the afternoon of the incident involving my client?" Gloria took a slow breath and nodded. "I was across the street tending to my roses. My husband had just laid out mulch that morning, and I was checking for beetles before the sun got too low." Her voice was gentle but unshaking. She didn't need to dramatize, she simply remembered. "I looked up," she continued, "because I heard tires on the pavement. That kind of low growl that says more than one cruiser's pulled up. I saw the officers get out walking fast, real tight in their bodies, like they were already angry at someone they hadn't even spoken to yet." She paused, eyes scanning the room briefly, then focused on the jury. "Then I saw Delilah Miss Raines walk toward them. I've seen her before. She helped organize a winter coat drive for the Veterans Center last year. Real respectful. Always has a kind word." Sterling nodded. "And what did you observe in that moment when she approached the officers? She asked them something, I couldn't hear what, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Her body wasn't tense. Her arms were at her sides. She just wanted to know what was going on, I suppose. And then the younger officer, Boone, I think, he stepped up real quick and grabbed her arm. No warning, no calm voice, just grabbed." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the judge's pen glide across her notes. A few jurors shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort but realization. Sterling continued, gently but clearly. "Did she resist?" Gloria didn't blink. Numbers, she looked surprised. Hurt maybe, but not angry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight. She tried to ask something again, but the taller one, Weller, he moved behind her, close enough that it looked like he was trying to block her from the street view. There was a pause, and Gloria's mouth tightened slightly before she added, and then he said something. I couldn't hear it clearly, but I saw his lips. It was ugly. The prosecution objected, citing speculation, but Judge Kane overruled it with a firm hand wave, noting the witness was describing visible behavior, not interpreting intent. Sterling asked one last question. "Mrs. James, do you believe what you witnessed that day was standard police conduct?" Gloria sat a little straighter. "I was born in Alabama in 1951. I've seen what force looks like when it's used to humiliate, not to protect. And what I saw was that." Silence followed her words like a slow wave. Even Craig Weller, who until now had been unmoved, looked away briefly, as if something behind her words reached further than the walls of that courtroom. Scott Boone fidgeted with his pen, his smirk noticeably absent for the first time since proceedings began. When the prosecutor approached for cross-examination, her tone was polite but pointed. She questioned Gloria's eyesight, asked how far she had stood from the scene, how certain she could be about what she saw. But Gloria met each question with the firm resolve of someone who had raised 3 boys and buried one too early, someone who had worked through budget cuts and school closures and neighborhood change without ever learning the language of backing down. "I don't need 20/20ths to see when a woman's being treated like she doesn't belong," she said gently. "I don't need perfect hearing to know when someone's being silenced." The prosecutor thanked her, though it rang hollow. Gloria stepped down slowly, her cane tapping a soft rhythm across the floor, and as she passed Delilah's table, their eyes met for the briefest moment, a shared understanding, not of suffering, but of dignity held under pressure. Delilah exhaled slowly, her fingers unclenching for the first time in what felt like hours. She leaned toward Sterling and whispered, "That mattered." They felt her. He nodded but didn't smile. "It's a start," he murmured. "We just cracked the door open." And as Gloria exited the room, the jury watched her not with pity, but with something approaching respect, maybe even belief. For the first time in that room, it was no longer just about legal definitions or body cam failures or protocol. It was about people, what they saw, what they remembered, what they could no longer ignore. And Delilah knew something had shifted, not enough to declare victory, but enough to change the air. Sterling Clay stood slowly, the wood of the bench creaking faintly beneath his weight, and for a moment the courtroom held its breath, not in anticipation of drama but in recognition of presence, the kind that didn't demand silence but naturally earned it. The overhead lights buzzed in the corners like tired insects, and someone in the gallery cleared their throat, but no one dared shift in their seat as Sterling turned to face the jury with a look that was steady, not sharp, his voice low, but certain as he called the next name to the stand. "Officer Scott Boone," he said, and the younger of the two defendants straightened slightly, his posture caught somewhere between bravado and reluctant compliance. Scott walked to the stand with the gait of a man used to being watched, but not questioned his uniform freshly, pressed his jaw-tight eyes, flicking briefly toward Delilah without lingering. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down like a man stepping onto familiar ground, only to find it softer than he expected. The prosecution had gone first, letting him speak with ease, letting him spin his story of a non-compliant subject of a woman who ignored verbal commands and became agitated terms that sounded official, clinical, detached, and yet were loaded with the quiet violence of false narratives. Delilah listened without blinking, her expression unreadable, but inside her chest something sharp began to twist, not because she hadn't heard lies like this before, but because she knew exactly how easily they could spread when uttered from a uniform, when wrapped in the language of procedure. Sterling rose again and the air changed subtly. He approached slowly, his voice calm, almost conversational, the way a doctor might speak before delivering news that mattered more than the words themselves. "You say Miss Raines was aggressive." Sterling began pacing slightly. "Yet in the surveillance video, she never raises her hands, never steps toward you. She simply asks a question. Can you explain that?" Boone shifted fingers, tapping the edge of the witness box. Sometimes he said carefully, "It's not about what you see, it's about tone posture, a sense of threat." "A sense of threat," Sterling echoed, tilting his head slightly. From a woman standing still, speaking calmly with no weapon, no sudden movements. Boone hesitated. "You weren't there," he said, not quite defensive but not confident either. "It's about instincts. We're trained to pick up on danger." Sterling nodded slowly. "Of course. And your body cam was that working at the time?" There was a pause just long enough to widen the silence. "No," Boone admitted. "It malfunctioned. Same with Officer Weller's." "Both malfunctioned," Sterling repeated, raising an eyebrow. "On the same call at the same time?" Boone's jaw tensed. "It happens." Sterling let the words hang, then moved closer. "What's more likely, Officer Boone, that both devices coincidentally failed, or that the footage would have contradicted your report?" "I stand by my report," Boone said firmly, but his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. Delilah watched as he started to fold into himself just a little, the confidence thinning at the edges like a rope fraying under pressure. Her mind drifted briefly to the day it all happened, how his hands were too quick, how his grip had tightened before she'd even had time to blink, how his partner's smirk felt colder than the metal of the cuffs. Now it was Craig Weller's turn. He was older, broader, the kind of man whose voice was used to carrying over noise, whose silence was often mistaken for authority. He walked to the stand like he was still patrolling a beat, slow, deliberate, with a kind of weight behind each step that dared the floor to creak. He swore in, then leaned back in his chair, arms wide, gaze fixed ahead. Sterling didn't waste time. "You claim Miss Raines made a verbal threat against you," he said, voice still even. "Can you recall the exact words?" Craig shifted. "She said something about knowing people in Washington, about making us regret it." Sterling nodded. "And you interpreted that as a threat?" Craig's eyes narrowed. "When someone brings up power like that, you take it seriously." And yet, Sterling said, turning to the jury, she never raised her voice, never used profanity, never attempted to flee or resist. "She was smug," Craig muttered. "Thought she was above the law." Sterling took a step closer. Or perhaps she believed the law should apply equally to everyone, including the men who arrested her without cause. Craig didn't answer, but something in his posture faltered, a slight retreat in the shoulders, a flicker in his jaw. The courtroom was quiet again, and in that silence truth began to take shape, not through fireworks, but through erosion, as the foundation of their story started to wear thin. Back at the defense table, Delilah exhaled, slowly, hands resting on her lap, her breathing steady but measured. She felt the weight of the room pressing in, not against her but around her, as if the collective conscience of everyone present had started to shift, even if they hadn't yet admitted it aloud. Sterling returned to his seat, his closing glance toward Delilah, not triumphant but grounded. He leaned in slightly and said, "They're unraveling." She nodded once. "And they don't even see it yet." The judge called for the day's adjournment, and the room slowly exhaled, people stretching, murmuring, collecting their coats, but the mood had changed. Boone and Weller walked out stiffly, no longer laughing, no longer at ease. And as Delilah stood, the light from the high windows caught her face just right, illuminating not just a defendant, but a woman holding her ground in a place built to push her down. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply walked out the same way she walked in, quietly but deliberately, like someone who understood the cost of silence and had chosen carefully and completely never to pay it again. The courthouse hallway was quieter now, not empty but hushed in the way. A chapel quiets after a difficult sermon, no one quite knowing what to say, only knowing something sacred or uncomfortable had been stirred. Delilah walked slowly, her footsteps softened by the worn carpet, her hands tucked in the pockets of her long navy coat, the fabric still holding the faint chill from the air-conditioned courtroom. The echoes of Boone and Weller's shaky testimonies still rang in her mind, not as victories, but as fractures, small breaks in a wall that had stood for too long on bad foundations. The fluorescent lighting above buzzed in irregular pulses, and the scent of machine-brewed coffee drifted faintly from a break room down the corridor, but Delilah barely noticed any of it. She turned into the small, private consultation room just off the main hallway where Sterling was already seated, his reading glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he scribbled something into a yellow legal pad. Across the room, Jada, Delilah's assistant, stood near the window, her eyes scanning her tablet, brows furrowed in that way. That meant she was reading between the lines, not just the text. The door clicked shut behind Delilah, and for a moment no one said anything. They didn't need to. The walls of that room had heard enough over the years, panicked strategies, whispered confessions, late-night settlements, but this silence held a different weight, one shaped by patience and calculation, not desperation. "They're sweating," Sterling said finally, without looking up. "Not enough to fold yet, but enough to start doubting their footing." Delilah leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed, her gaze drifting to the closed blinds where slits of afternoon light painted pale lines across the wall, like a cage made of sun. "They still don't know who I am," she said, her voice even, but lower than usual, as if saying it aloud might change the timeline. "No," Jada replied, her tone matter-of-fact but tinged with tension. "But the moment's coming." Sterling looked up now, meeting Delilah's eyes with a steadiness that had nothing to prove, only something to affirm. "You sure you want to keep holding it?" Delilah exhaled, slow and controlled, the kind of breath you learn to take when walking into classified briefings, or stepping onto stages where the stakes aren't just personal, they're national. If I show my hand too early, they'll pivot bury what matters, make it about power plays and egos. Sterling nodded the corners of his mouth, drawing into a frown of reluctant agreement. "And if we wait too long, then we risk losing the narrative," Jada said, stepping forward, her voice quiet but focused. "They'll paint you as manipulative, hiding your status to trick the system." Delilah closed her eyes briefly, her mind tracing every possible branch of consequence like a map she'd studied 1,000 times. She thought of the late-night calls with the department, the quiet approval from the deputy secretary, the legal clearance already tucked away in a secure folder. None of that changed the fact that this wasn't about federal positioning, it was about principle, about the everyday citizens who would never get the chance to defend themselves with a title behind their name. "This isn't about proving I have power," she said quietly, her voice gathering weight like a slow tide. "It's about showing what happens when people assume I don't." Sterling put down his pen, slowly removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I can delay the big moves until we bring in the next key witness, Morales. If he confirms the body cam failures were intentional, we'll have enough momentum to justify revealing who you are. And when we do," Jada added, "it has to be surgical, not defensive, not proud, just clear and undeniable." Delilah opened her eyes again, her gaze steady, now sharper. She had spent years in rooms where security briefings ran longer than meals, where she memorized risk matrices the way others memorized recipes. But none of that prepared her for this kind of exposure, the kind where everything you are becomes public, not because you chose to run for office or sought the spotlight, but because silence is no longer an option. "We'll wait," she said, "until Morales. Then we strike." There was no applause, no rallying cry, just a silent agreement passed between them, like the weight of a decision carried together. Sterling turned back to his notes. Jada stepped out to take a secure call, and Delilah remained alone for a moment in the quiet of the room, listening to the distant echoes of footsteps in the hall, each one a reminder that justice doesn't arrive all at once, it presses forward in inches. She looked down at the table where her closed folder sat untouched, its cover worn slightly at the corners, and rested her hand atop it gently like someone touching the edge of a memory. The truth, she knew, wasn't just a weapon, it was a mirror, and once she held it up they would all have to look. And none of them, not Craig, not Scott, not the judge, not the press, were ready for what they would see. The morning began with a cold, quiet tension that clung to the courthouse like frost on a window pane, invisible, but felt by everyone who stepped through the heavy glass doors. Delilah sat silently at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes trained forward but not fixed on anything in particular, as though she were listening to something deeper than the voices around her. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the subtle rustle of coats, notepads, and whispered conversations filled the air like the soft movements of people trying to pretend this was just another ordinary day in a place built to hold extraordinary truths. Sterling leaned over his voice just above a whisper, not breaking her focus but grounding her to the moment. "He's here," he said simply. He walked in through the side entrance. "Looks calm." Delilah didn't answer right away, but her breath shifted slightly shallower, now measured like someone bracing for something they've rehearsed 1,000 times, but still don't quite trust to land gently. She looked toward the hallway doors just in time to see Sergeant Miguel Alvarez step into the room, his uniform crisp, his boots polished, but his eyes telling a different story, one that had taken months, maybe years, to carry here. Alvarez had the kind of posture that came from decades of service, not stiff but steady, like a man who had stood in more storms than he could count and had learned not to flinch when the wind picked up. As he took the stand and was sworn in, the courtroom adjusted itself subtly, like the air was making room for something heavier, something more truthful than what had come before. Even the jury, which had grown used to the back and forth of competing narratives, seemed to lean in a little closer, their attention sharpening as if instinctively sensing that this wasn't going to be another hollow recital of procedure. Sterling approached slowly, his tone respectful but direct. "Sergeant Alvarez, can you describe your involvement in the incident involving my client, Miss Raines?" Alvarez cleared his throat once, then nodded. "I arrived on scene after the initial arrest had taken place. I was responding as backup per protocol, but the call had already gone quiet by the time I arrived." Sterling nodded. "And when you arrived, what did you observe?" Alvarez glanced toward Delilah for the briefest moment, then looked back to the jury. Miss Raines was already in the back of a squad car. Officers Boone and Weller were standing nearby. What struck me immediately was that neither of them had their body cams on. A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff's firm glance. Sterling waited a beat before speaking again, his voice even. "Is that unusual?" "Very," Alvarez replied without hesitation. "Standard protocol requires body cams remain active throughout any civilian engagement unless there's a documented equipment failure. Neither officer had filed such a report that day. And when you asked them about it," Sterling pressed his hands, calmly clasped behind his back. Alvarez shifted in his seat, but not uncomfortably. "Boone told me the battery had died. Weller said his was acting up earlier in the shift. They brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal." "Did you believe them?" Sterling asked. Alvarez hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because the truth was a blade you had to hold carefully. "No," he said finally. "I didn't." The room sat still for a moment, no paper rustling, no pens moving, just the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted again. Sterling moved closer, voice still calm. "Sergeant, have you had prior concerns regarding the conduct of Officers Boone and Weller?" Alvarez nodded slower this time. "Yes. Over the past 2 years, I've filed 3 internal reports regarding the use of excessive force and inappropriate language by both officers. The reports went nowhere. I was told they were reviewed, but no action was taken. And were any of those reports related to behavior in minority communities? Sterling asked gently but with precision. Alvarez's mouth tightened slightly, and his jaw clenched before he answered. All 3 were. At the defense table, Delilah felt something deep in her chest. Unclench, not relief, not yet, but a loosening like the first button undone after hours of restraint. She looked at Alvarez with quiet recognition, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of respect reserved for those who break the rules, not out of defiance, but out of allegiance to something greater than silence. The prosecutor stood for cross-examination, her tone sharp but composed. She questioned Alvarez's timing, his motivations, even his memory, but each answer came back with the steadiness of a man who had learned long ago that truth requires repetition when systems are built not to hear it the first time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't embellish. He just answered with the kind of clarity that stripped the room bare. As Alvarez stepped down, the jury watched him go with expressions that had lost their earlier detachment. Delilah noticed one juror, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a teacher's posture, press her lips together and nod once slowly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't agreement, it was recognition. Back in their private consultation room, Sterling closed the door behind them and leaned his weight against the wall, rubbing his temples with both hands. "He did more than I expected," he said, his voice low. "He told the truth," Delilah replied, removing her jacket and hanging it over the back of a chair. "That's what they're not ready for." Jada stepped in a moment later, her phone still in hand, her expression focused. "We're trending," she said, holding up the screen. "Number Justice for Reigns, number Westvale Truth." The footage clip from earlier and Alvarez's statement are blowing up. Delilah didn't look at the screen. She sat down, folding her hands again, her mind already moving to the next step. "They think this is the crescendo," she said softly. "But it's just the prelude." And as she leaned back in the chair, letting her eyes close for the first time that day, she knew this wasn't about just one trial anymore. It was about making sure the next woman like her wouldn't need a title to be believed. The city outside had started to wake up to the trial in a way that felt different now, not just whispers or headlines, but something that hummed through the sidewalks and coffee shops in the way people paused longer when the courthouse came on the news, or how the barista at the corner cafe nodded silently when Delilah passed by that morning offering a warm drink without a word. The air felt thicker too, not heavy with fear, but with attention, the kind that wraps around you like a thread pulling tighter with each step forward. Inside the courthouse, the mood had shifted as well. The spectators weren't just watching anymore, they were listening, leaning in, waiting for what came next, not out of curiosity, but because the truth had started to taste like something they might believe in. Delilah stood near the window of the consultation room, watching the wind press against the glass, the bare branches of a distant tree scratching softly as if trying to speak. Her reflection in the window didn't surprise her anymore. Shoulders back, jaw steady, the same woman she had learned to be when walking into rooms that didn't expect her to speak with authority. She'd worn this face in classified briefings at state dinners in crisis command centers, buried deep underground, and yet somehow this small courtroom in Westvale felt heavier than all of them combined. Behind her, Jada sat at the table, fingers tapping rhythmically on her tablet, as she updated files and flagged timestamps. Her focus never wavered, but her silence carried a kind of tension, like she was holding her breath alongside her data. Sterling entered a moment later, closing the door behind him with a soft click, a folder under one arm, and his phone in the other, eyes already scanning a new string of messages from someone downtown. "They've started damage control," he said without looking up. "City PR teams meeting with the police chief. They want to separate the department from the officers." Delilah turned away from the window, crossing her arms as she leaned against the edge of the table. "That won't hold. Not with what Alvarez said yesterday." Sterling set the folder down gently and gave a dry laugh, the kind that holds more fatigue than humor. "They're hoping it does. Internal Affairs is claiming they've opened a review, but it's mostly smoke." Delilah nodded, not surprised. She had seen this playbook before, contained deflect delay. Systems like this didn't collapse from a single truth, no matter how loud it echoed. They withstood storms by pretending to listen while reinforcing their own walls behind the scenes. "Let them try," she said. "We're not done." Sterling looked at her, then really looked the way you do when you need to measure someone's energy, not just their words. "We could pivot, you know. Bring your title in now. Make it impossible to ignore you." Delilah didn't answer right away. She glanced down at the table where her unopened badge file still sat, the DHS seal visible but unspoken like a weapon tucked into a drawer you never wanted to use unless you absolutely had to. She traced the edge of the folder with one finger, her thoughts drifting not to power or headlines but to the image of herself, at age 12, sitting on her grandmother's porch in the Mississippi heat, watching a local officer yell at her, an uncle for standing too long outside the gas station after dark. That officer had smiled afterward like it meant nothing, but she remembered the way her uncle didn't speak for 3 days. "I'm not hiding who I am," she said finally. "I'm protecting what it means." Jada looked up, her voice, soft but firm. "People are starting to guess. Twitter's circling. If we wait too long it might look like a stunt. Then it has to be earned." Delilah replied, her tone quiet but resolute. "It can't come from fear, it has to come from necessity." Sterling rubbed his chin, then nodded slowly. "Tomorrow then, after Gardner testifies. That gives us the contrast. We need psychology, policy, lived experience. After that, we break the story." The room fell into silence for a few moments, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that follows a decision no one wants to celebrate too soon. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the glass, and the afternoon light slanted lower, streaking the far wall with golden stripes that looked almost like bars. Delilah stood up straighter, letting the light hit her fully, not flinching, not stepping back. Later that day, when they walked back into the courtroom, the energy felt more charged than usual. More reporters in the back row, more people whispering into phones, more cameras that pretended not to be aimed, but absolutely were. Delilah ignored them. She had learned long ago that attention didn't equal understanding, and that some gazes were meant to measure rather than witness. She took her seat, unzipped her case, and laid her notebook flat. Across the aisle, Boone sat hunched a little lower than usual, and Weller avoided her eyes altogether, his fingers twitching against the edge of his chair. The prosecutor, still composed, shuffled her papers with just a hint more urgency than the day before. Even the judge looked more alert, as if the undertow of the case had finally pulled her into deeper water. Delilah closed her eyes for a moment, took a breath, and prepared herself, not for battle but for the next step. Forward a step, not toward victory but toward clarity. She wasn't there to destroy reputations. She was there to demand accountability, not with rage but with precision. Because sometimes the most powerful blow isn't the one that lands hardest. It's the one no one saw coming until it changes everything. The courtroom was still the kind of stillness that doesn't come from quiet, but from a collective breath being held in anticipation, from the tension that builds when everyone knows something important is about to happen, though no one can quite name it yet. Morning light filtered in through the tall windows, soft and golden, illuminating the dust floating lazily in the air, as if time itself had slowed to watch. Delilah Raines sat at the defense table with her hands folded, palms resting lightly against one another, her eyes focused not on the jury, not on the prosecutor, not even on the judge, but inward, toward something she had carried for too long, without release. Her suit was perfectly pressed, her posture unshakably straight, but it wasn't polish that kept her still. It was purpose. Sterling leaned toward her and spoke just above a whisper, his voice steady but lined with quiet gravity. "It's time," he said, his eyes searching hers for a final confirmation, not for legal strategy, but for readiness, the kind that only comes from within. Delilah didn't blink. "Let's begin," she said softly. And when she stood, the scrape of her chair against the hardwood floor sounded louder than it should have, like the first roll of distant thunder on a hot afternoon. Judge Kane watched her rise with an expression that bordered on curiosity, as if unsure whether this moment would be procedural or pivotal. The prosecutor narrowed her gaze pen, paused mid-sentence, sensing a shift she couldn't yet define. The gallery leaned forward, reporters' fingers hovering over record buttons, the air suddenly too dense with expectation to breathe freely. Sterling approached the bench. Your Honor, the defense calls Delilah Raines to the stand. There was no murmur of surprise, only a long exhale from someone in the back row, a reminder that while some had seen this coming, no one knew where it would lead. Delilah stepped toward the witness stand without haste, but with the kind of presence that made even the court officer who swore her in pause just a beat longer than usual. She raised her right-hand eyes steady and repeated the oath as though it were not the first time she had sworn to uphold something greater than herself. As she sat, the room adjusted around her like the weight of what she carried had shifted the entire center of gravity. Sterling's voice was calm, guiding, but no longer cautious. "Miss Raines, would you tell the court a little about your background?" Delilah didn't hesitate. "I was born in Natchez, Mississippi." She began, her tone conversational but rooted in memory. "My parents were school teachers. They believed in justice not as a word but as a responsibility. I grew up watching them fight for kids who were always told to be quiet, to sit still, to not expect too much." She paused just briefly, letting that truth settle before continuing. "I studied criminal justice and political science. I joined the FBI at 27, Counter-Terrorism Division. Then, civil rights. I worked investigations, briefed senators, trained task forces." The jury leaned in closer, now some with brows raised, others blinking like they had misheard her. Delilah took a breath, not to steady herself, but to pace the truth. "After 22 years in federal service, I transitioned to national security policy. I've served under 2 administrations, and currently—" She paused, then her gaze sweeping across the room, not dramatic, but deliberate. "I am the Deputy Director of the United States Department of Homeland Security." Gasps broke from the gallery like a dam, had cracked sharp, involuntary sounds of disbelief, reporters scrambling to capture the moment, even Judge Kane straightening slightly in her seat pen, frozen in midair. The prosecutor's face shifted from skeptical to pale, her hand clenching her folder, like she might squeeze the moment back into something manageable. But Delilah wasn't finished. "I didn't tell you that sooner," she said, addressing the jury now, her voice steady, "because my title isn't what matters. My presence that day on that street wasn't about being a federal official, it was about being a citizen, a neighbor, a woman concerned that a disabled veteran down the block was being intimidated again by the same officers I'd heard complaints about." She glanced briefly at Boone and Weller, whose smugness had drained, completely replaced by something smaller, something like disbelief wrapped in fear. "They didn't ask who I was," she continued. "They didn't care. They saw my skin. They saw a woman questioning their authority. That was enough." Sterling stood silently beside her, letting her words lead, his face unreadable but his eyes shining with something close to awe. No argument he could make would ever carry what she had just laid bare. Delilah leaned forward slightly. "This case is not about me. It's not about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about how easy it is for people to abuse power when they believe no one's watching, and how quickly they retreat when they find out someone was." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not here as a high-ranking official. I'm here as a woman who stood still and asked a question. And for that I was thrown against a car, handcuffed and mocked." She looked back at the jury, her eyes soft now but unyielding. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the witnesses. You know the truth. Now the question is, what will you do with it?" The room remained silent long after she stepped down her chair, sliding quietly back into place, her composure intact but not untouched. Reporters frantically typed, but the story had already been written, in the looks exchanged, in the silence that followed, in the certainty that something irreversible had just happened. Sterling sat beside her again, leaning in close. "You just changed everything." Delilah didn't smile. "No," she said. "I just told them what was always true." Outside, the afternoon light had shifted again, casting longer shadows through the tall courthouse windows like the day itself was stretching to keep up with the moment. And inside, in that still and echoing room, the reckoning had finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the courtroom the following morning was different, not louder, not busier, just heavier, like the weight of the previous day hadn't quite lifted, and no one had figured out how to breathe around it yet. The gallery was packed tighter than usual, the familiar faces now joined by a few national reporters with polished suits and pressed badges, their attention sharpened not by curiosity, but by the scent of something seismic unfolding. Even Judge Kane walked in more slowly, eyes scanning the room like she expected the furniture to have rearranged itself overnight. There was no gavel this time, just her voice measured crisp, a little hoarser than before, calling the court to order like she was speaking directly into the tension. Delilah sat at the defense table as she had all week, but her body felt slightly less anchored than usual, like some invisible cord between her spine, and the seat had finally loosened. She was aware of the eyes on her, not just watching but searching, questioning, evaluating, and she met them without flinching, but without inviting anything either. She hadn't come to win a popularity contest, and she wasn't interested in being turned into anyone's symbol. She just wanted the truth to outlive the noise. Sterling leaned toward her, his breath steady, his voice low. "They're scrambling," he murmured. "Calls from the mayor's office state, rep, even someone from the department." Delilah gave the slightest nod. "Let them scramble," she whispered. "The truth's already walking." The prosecution looked less sure of themselves now. Graves had traded her bright tones and clipped confidence for something more reserved, more careful, like a woman trying not to step on ice that had already cracked beneath her feet. Craig Weller and Scott Boone no longer sat like men in control. They looked like men waiting for a storm to find their names. Weller's arms were folded across his chest, but his posture sagged slightly, and Boone tapped his fingers against the table with a restlessness that betrayed the confidence he used to wear like armor. Sterling stood and moved to the center of the room, holding a stack of printed pages, not flashy exhibits, but records, documentation, time-stamped and reviewed, the kind of paper trail that doesn't yell but leaves bruises. "Today," he said calmly, "we'll be reviewing the complaint history for Officers Weller and Boone." The judge didn't blink. She motioned for him to continue. Page by page, Sterling walked the courtroom through a timeline of misconduct. Every incident documented excessive force during traffic stops, verbal harassment toward Latino teenagers, a complaint involving the unlawful search of a veteran's home. Many of them had been dismissed by Internal Affairs with the phrase, "insufficient evidence," but the volume, the pattern, the proximity of one report to the next, it was undeniable. He didn't need to editorialize. The numbers spoke for themselves. Delilah sat quietly, her hands folded again, but her breathing had changed, slower now, deeper, like she was breathing in the last mile of a long march. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, and it certainly wasn't revenge. It was something heavier, something closer to release. The jurors listened without shifting this time. They looked at the records, then at the officers, then back at the records again. Even the courtroom spectators weren't whispering anymore. The only sound was the steady hum of the overhead lights and the occasional scratch of someone's pen trying to keep up. Sterling paused. "These aren't anomalies," he said. "They're not isolated incidents. They're warnings that went unanswered." And Miss Raines was arrested by the same men whose judgment has now been repeatedly called into question. He walked back to the defense table, his steps unhurried, like a man who knew he didn't have to push the boulder uphill anymore because it had started rolling on its own. Then, just before the judge could call for a recess, something unexpected happened. Craig Weller stood. It wasn't dramatic. There was no noise, no outburst, just the slow scraping of a chair and the rise of a man who had run out of places to hide. The room froze. Boone turned toward him, eyes wide with confusion or maybe panic, and the prosecutor whispered something sharp that Weller ignored. "I'd like to say something," he said, voice rough, directed toward the judge. Judge Kane blinked once. "Are you requesting to testify again?" "No," he said. I just want to say something on the record." She hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed briefly." Craig Weller looked at Delilah just for a second, and then back at the room. "I made a mistake," he said. "More than one. I let bias guide my decisions. I let my assumptions speak louder than the facts." A few gasps, muffled and soft, passed through the gallery like wind through trees. Boone shifted in his seat as if unsure whether to follow or flee. "I treated Miss Raines unfairly," Weller continued. "I judged her before I knew her, and I'm sorry." Delilah didn't move. She didn't blink. She just listened. Then, in the silence that followed, Scott Boone stood too. He swallowed hard, looked at the floor, and then said, "Same for me. I didn't know who she was, but that shouldn't matter. What we did was wrong." No one clapped. No one cheered. Because it didn't feel like a moment of redemption, it felt like exposure. Sterling leaned toward Delilah again, voice barely above a breath. Calculated, maybe. But useful. Delilah's voice was almost too quiet to hear. Their apology's not justice, she said, but it's the beginning of accountability. And with that, the judge called for recess, her gavel sounding louder than it had all week, as if marking the end of something, some unspoken chapter, some invisible resistance that had finally cracked. Outside, the courthouse reporters rushed for updates, microphones lifted like weapons, but inside, something more fragile had shifted. A truth had been spoken publicly by the very men who tried to bury it, and now there was no putting it back in the dark. The final day of testimony arrived cloaked in a silence that felt less like calm and more like the quiet before a verdict, thick with the kind of waiting that presses behind your ribs and wraps around your spine. The courtroom didn't buzz like it had in the earlier days. There were no whispered speculations or muffled gasps, only the occasional rustle of coat fabric or the muted click of a reporter's pen adjusting in hand. It was the kind of silence that suggested people weren't just watching history unfold, they were bracing for it. Delilah Raines sat motionless at the defense table, her fingers lightly interlaced, her chin lifted just enough to signal presence but not defiance. Her breath was slow and measured, not out of nerves, but because she knew the truth wasn't something that rushed it, revealed itself slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of things long buried finally rising to the surface. Sterling had barely spoken that morning, his usual quiet confidence sharpened into something more exacting, more focused, as if he had already seen the shape of the ending and was simply waiting for the system to catch up. Jada, seated quietly in the back of the room, watched with a calm intensity, her tablet dark, for once her hands resting on her knees, eyes trained on the jury not to read them, but to honor them, to hold them, in that moment, as witnesses, not just participants. The judge entered with a slower gait, her expression unreadable, but her presence still commanding, as if even she had begun to recognize that what had started as a simple hearing had grown into something else, something neither she nor the court could contain. After final arguments, after documents had been submitted, and objections made and sustained after the truth had been repeated enough times to become something undeniable, the room exhaled. And then the jury filed out. It took 3 hours. 3 hours where the building seemed to fall into an unnatural stillness, broken only by footsteps in distant corridors, or the low rumble of an air conditioning unit kicking in and out of service. Delilah remained at the table, not pacing, not reviewing notes, just still like someone who had carried a weight long enough to no longer measure it in pounds but in memory. Sterling sat beside her occasionally, glancing over not to reassure her, but to stand with her in the silence as any true ally does. When the bailiff finally re-entered and gave a single silent nod, the courtroom rose. Everyone stood with a kind of reverence that hadn't existed at the start of the week, when Delilah was just a name on a docket, another case to move through a system that had long mistaken speed for justice. But now they stood with something different in their bones, respect perhaps, or a shared understanding that this verdict wasn't just about law, it was about value. It was about whether a woman like Delilah could ask a question and not be punished for it. The foreman rose, a tall man with tired eyes, and a voice that barely rose above the quiet. On the charge of false arrest, he said, "We find the defendants guilty." A pause. On the charge of filing a false report, guilty. Another pause. On the charge of civil rights violation, guilty. No applause. No shouts. Just breath. Slow, stunned, collective breath. Delilah didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She just closed her eyes for half a second, like someone finally setting down a weight they'd carried too far too long. Beside her, Sterling placed a hand gently on the table, not reaching for her, not celebrating, just grounding, just witnessing. The judge cleared her throat and turned to the officers, her voice firm but not loud. "Your badges are hereby revoked. You are to be remanded to federal custody pending further civil rights proceedings." Then, looking at Delilah just for a moment, she added, "This court recognizes the integrity with which you conducted yourself throughout this trial." Outside the world erupted cameras, flashing reporters, shouting hashtags trending before the courtroom doors even closed. But inside, Delilah gathered her folder, adjusted her coat, and walked out the same way she had walked in, head held high, spine straight steps, measured not in victory but in clarity. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught sight of Reverend Langston, eyes moist with quiet pride, standing next to Laura Bennett, the conservative columnist, who had once dismissed her story as an overreaction, but now held a notepad to her chest like it had burned something true into her hands. They didn't speak. They just nodded. Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes the shift in a person's eyes says more than any apology. And still Delilah didn't stop. She didn't linger for the cameras or the questions. She kept walking because justice had been named, but the work was far from finished. Not everyone who needed it had heard it yet, and she intended to carry the echo a little further. The weeks that followed the verdict passed not with celebration, but with something quieter, deeper, an unspoken shift in the rhythm of the city, like a pulse that had been out of sync for years, finally finding its natural beat again. The courthouse steps, once marked by protest signs and shouts of frustration, now bore the footprints of quiet visitors, neighbors, students, elders, who came not for drama but to stand in a place where something real had happened, something that had forced the system to stop, to listen, and for once to answer. Delilah Raines moved through those days with a calm that wasn't prideful but rooted, anchored by the knowledge that what had unfolded wasn't an ending but a beginning no one could undo. Westvale Police Department, under federal oversight, began a slow, uneasy transformation. Officers were retrained. Leadership was replaced. A new civilian oversight board was introduced, and while skepticism lingered like fog, a different kind of conversation began taking place on front porches and at school board meetings, in churches and barbershops, conversations that carry weight because people had seen what accountability looked like with their own eyes. And Delilah, though she had returned to her role in Homeland Security, didn't retreat into Washington corridors or federal briefings. She stayed connected. One afternoon she returned to the street where it all began. The same block, the same crooked sidewalk, the same porch with the peeling rail. But now children played along the curb without nervous glances, and an elderly man, once afraid to call for help, waved from behind a screen door with a grin that reached his eyes. At the edge of the neighborhood park, a mural had been painted, her silhouette standing tall, not as a monument but as a symbol of the power in being seen, in not backing down. She walked slowly, her heels softer on the pavement than the boots she wore in her field days, her gaze absorbing the details, how the old oak tree was still bent from the last storm, how the air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and grilled corn, how peace in places like this wasn't loud but steady. Sterling had joined her that day, standing just a few steps behind, not speaking, just observing. "You ever think it would go this way?" he asked, his voice low, hands in his pockets. Delilah paused, letting the question settle in the space between them. "I didn't think it would go any way at all," she said. "I just knew I couldn't let it stay the same." Behind them, Jada spoke with a group of local students who had gathered around the mural, asking questions, taking notes, sharing ideas for a community youth program they wanted to name after her. Delilah smiled but waved them off gently. "Name it after yourselves," she said. "This story isn't mine alone." Later that month, at a small city hall ceremony, longtime civil rights leaders were honored alongside local residents who had spoken out during the trial. Reverend Langston, voice thick with age and memory, accepted a medal with tears in his eyes. Even Laura Bennett, the once critical columnist, stood at the podium and admitted she had been wrong. "I judged her," she said, "but more than that, I underestimated her, and I won't do that again." The room didn't erupt with applause. It exhaled. And in that exhale, something sacred was exchanged, not forgiveness necessarily, but acknowledgement. Delilah stood off to the side, not on stage, not in the spotlight. She didn't need it. Her work now extended far beyond any single courtroom. She was helping launch a coalition that would connect legal advocates, educators, and faith leaders to provide community defense training for marginalized neighborhoods. Not just policy, but protection, preparation, power. When a reporter asked her if she felt vindicated, she paused thoughtfully before answering. "I don't need vindication," she said. "I need change, and I need it to last longer than headlines." As the sun dipped low that evening, casting a warm amber glow across the buildings and benches, Delilah walked alone for a while past a school where kids still laughed through open windows, past a grocery store that had finally reopened under new management, past silence that now felt earned instead of imposed. She didn't walk with urgency or with ceremony. She walked like someone who had made peace with the long road, someone who understood that the fight for dignity wasn't a single event but a daily choice. A rhythm. A promise kept not just to herself, but to every person who had once been told they had no right to ask, no right to speak, no right to stand. And as the last light of day painted gold across her shoulders, Delilah Raines didn't look back. She looked forward. Because the work wasn't done, but the path finally was clear. What happened in this story wasn't just about one courtroom or one woman standing up against two officers. It was about what happens when silence is no longer an option, when someone dares to speak truth to power, not with anger, but with clarity, discipline, and grace. Delilah Raines reminded us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still, asks a question, and refuses to back down. She didn't fight for recognition, she fought for fairness. And in doing so, she made space for others who have been ignored, dismissed, or mistreated simply for daring to be seen. For those of us watching, especially our older generation who've lived through years of injustice and change, this story holds a deeper meaning. It reminds us that the long road to justice is walked step by step, and it's never too late to speak, to act, to make a difference in our communities. Whether you've marched in the 60s or mentored your neighbors more quietly, your voice still matters. You still matter. So if this story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect, share it. Share it with your children, your neighbors, your church group. Let someone else hear what justice sounds like when it finally gets a chance to speak. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories that uplift and challenge, and hit that bell so you won't miss the next one. Because storytelling isn't just entertainment, it's how we remember who we are and who we still have the power to become.